it's about motivating people to come together around common values and causes. And how do we do that on a grand scale? What would be an event that would change people? Wake them up, so to speak. I think to use Freud's notion of the reality principle, and so when you're talking about consuming and destroying the environment, I mean, at some point, the environment's going to punish you. It's going to cause people to wake up. They're going to say, we have to change our way of being, or we'll be destroying ourselves.
Yes.
And that hasn't happened yet. In fact, you have politicians who want to deny, that there's anything wrong with the burning of fossil fuels and all these other things. But at some point, people are going to say this is bullshit. We do have to change. We have to vote for different people in office to change these policies, and that we have to do some self-sacrifice. We have to give up some things that we were used to in our own comfortable life. So whether that be financial or whether that be, just regulatory changes in the way we consume things. So that's the collective that I'm hoping will, start to organize.
So we got this thing about the future of the world. It's like, what's going to happen? The chaos is only increasing. And some people are suggesting it's the end of days, the fundamental Christian view of the apocalypse coming through the book of Revelations, for some of you who know that. There are other ways to look at that, but there's still a lot of pessimism now about where we're going. And our guest today is a welcomer of the pessimism, even though he doesn't like it. And I think his book is written to try to get past the pessimism, but he's a basic kind of psychoanalytic guy, and Freud was kind of like a dour guy underneath, even though his name was Freud, which means joy in German. Still, he didn't have much positivity, especially when the Nazis kicked him out of Austria in 1939. And it's worth remembering when Freud was asked to write a letter to the Nazis, recommend positive letter about the Nazis. He said, "Oh yes, the Nazis are wonderful. I recommend them to anyone." And that kind of overstatement still got him out of there to England, but it really changed everything for him to have to get out of Vienna. So he was in a terrible time. And those terrible times are, for many people, still with us. Our guest today will help us talk about some of the difficulties we're in. But in his book, The End of the World, notice the black, but there's a light going through that. And it's the light that I'm hoping to pay attention to as we talk about Jon Mills' new book. He's a Canadian philosopher, psychoanalyst, and retired clinical psychologist whose work sits at the intersection of continental philosophy, which there's only one continent there, that's Europe, depth psychology, and cultural criticism. An honorary professor in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex, faculty in the postgraduate program in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy at Adelphi, and lots more. He's written several books, recipient of numerous awards, and author or editor of over 30 books. I mean, this guy writes, and he writes well. And his book spans Psychoanalysis, Philosophy, and Cultural Studies. And this book is his latest. Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence, Jon. Pleasure to have you with me.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on.
Well, it's as often happens when authors come on the podcast, the podcaster asks a standard question. I don't do this most of the time, but with you, I'm doing it. Hey, Jon, why did you write this? Hey, what were you trying to do here, Jon?
Well, you anticipated why, because I'm trying to work out the problem in my own head. So hopefully by the end of that book, I was going to come to some meaningful conclusion, and a thread of optimism might blossom. Um, However, it looks like the pessimism, the cloud stayed with you as you looked at my work. And unfortunately, it's staying with us now.
Is it still staying with you, even though you wrote it? You got some positivity towards the end, but and you're not a guy who stands still. You keep moving. So you've been thinking since you've written it and since it's finished. Has your pessimism stayed at the same level, or are you seeing anything positive in being able to happen?
Well, it's rather difficult to to stay totally optimistic about things when we're on the verge of a possible world war. What's going on in Iran, um, and it worries me. It does. It's something that um, all these overdetermined forces and processes that can happen at once to our civilization could take a really bad turn, but it could also take a positive one. It's just like this is a crapshoot. You just don't really know how to predict the future. Um, Unfortunately, though, we have to go on the past, and past is usually the best predictor. And the notion that we are still engaged in um, a spate of human aggression in this day and age of the pinnacle of our enlightenment with science and technology, that it's mind-boggling.
And yet, here we are. I think the part of the future, our future, has to be being okay with uncertainty. We've been pretty good at predicting things, but not always. And you know very well where somebody comes in as a patient and you don't know what's going to happen. But when my view of psychotherapy includes having an optimistic, positive image of the future of the patient that I am dealing with. It's
Mhm.
almost like an obligation of the therapist to do that. I don't think it's said often enough that that's what therapists do. It's mostly about the past and then maybe about the here and now. But the future is where we're moving. When they leave the office, they're walking into a future. So holding the image of the future, a positive one for the patient, is a basic necessity of the therapist. What is your opinion of that?
Yeah, that's a very humanistic approach to healing, and I would I would I would start to question why anybody would go into the profession, the helping profession, if they didn't really want to foster or engender some notion of hope in their patients. Um, uh, so I would agree that would be a natural part of, or ingredients in, the therapeutic relationship that should come across to the patient.
Well, I'm talking more not just about hope generically. I'm talking about for that patient some image of what they could be, which actually becomes a representation in my mind of what they would like themselves to be.
Mhm. Well, certainly, as someone who comes from an existential background, if if one didn't have this feeling of authenticity to try to develop in themselves and becoming their own possibilities, then what's the point of living? So definitely, if my role is to help that person in their process of becoming, it is through a genuine and honest dialogue. And that usually always includes some type of image of the future, what one wants to become, as well as a real ethical kind of commitment to oneself and one's development.
Indeed. And what I was also adding to that is that sometimes I, as the therapist, fill in some more details than they have in their own minds about where they're going. It's the same idea, but it's more detailed, and I hold it not like it's must, but as a possibility. So let me ask you this related to your book. You diagnose collective bystander disorder as a core reason we fail to act. Collective bystander disorder. But isn't psychoanalytic consciousness raising a form of bystander behavior?
Well, I suppose we cannot help but be bystanders to about anything as a collective. So in that regard, we we observe, we we live, we experience, sometimes more actively than passively. But in this context, I was really struggling with trying to understand why is it that collective humanity seems to be um, rather at an impasse of acting to stop certain types of global threats. One of them, climate change, of course, the threat of nuclear engagement or war, and the list goes on. You know, threats of technology, AI, the economic disparities, and so forth. So that's a different context than I think what you're bringing up.
Yeah, it definitely is a different context. It's an analogical context, is what I'm trying to bring up. That there is a collective bystander effect, and that's what you're trying to be able to say. Uh, and what I'm suggesting is that psychoanalysis can make people tuned into their own self-development sufficiently that that's what they continue to do, so they become bystanders themselves. It's just an encouragement of self-development with not much attention to what's going on in the world.
Well, um, I think the positive outcome of a successful therapy would be what you just said, a certain consciousness or raising or awareness of bigger picture and how that affects their lives and you know what they can do to contribute to improving the world.
Well, yes, and that's what I'm asking about. Uh, the 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 general idea I have of psychoanalysis is is to improve your own development. so that you're able to be okay with yourself and maybe even better with yourself than okay. But there's not a cultural drive within psychoanalysis to use that agency that you develop to then do something in the world.
Well, there's a lot of different developments that are going on within the field itself. Currently, right now, there has been what they call a social turn, where people are very interested in activist behavior and psychoanalytic applications to society and culture as a whole. But that's kind of a little bit of a side note. There are a number of people who believe that we need to take psychoanalytic ideas and principles and sensibilities out of the consulting room and apply it to the greater collectives at large. And yeah, there's been a number of people who've brought it to clinics, to the streets. I, I do think there is some application, some development that that we see spreading today.
There's no question that psychoanalysis has, for a long time, tried to apply some of its ideas to culture, to understand how culture operates. Cultural psychoanalytical thinking has been around. It's more analytical. I mean, that's the term. It's the agency part that Freud was not that particularly interested in. He was interested in analyzing psyches. That's what he was doing. He was doing research in his consulting room about how the mind worked. And how much change came out of that, as I understood it, was not the major purpose. And so after a while, other schools of therapy developed that were more active. Harry Stack Sullivan's uh, method was more about asking questions, and then you got in the 60s transactional analysis, which is still ego, id, superego related, but much more interpersonal, transactional, change the way you are with people. And there got to be psychoanalytic groups and then psychoanalytic applications to society in general, to family therapy, and all over the place. There was still underlying, and what I get from your book is still the kind of self-development idea, the understanding the idea, but the agency part of it is what I think I found looking at your book and knowing something about psychoanalysis, a less emphasis.
Well, I mean, these are scholarly debates, right? If one if one of Freud's major principles was to make the unconscious conscious, that would mean having insight in one's own inner psyche and one's conflicts, and that would mean developing a sense of agency, developing a sense of self-conscious awareness. And if one doesn't do something with that once they attain it, once they realize all the different conflicts and defenses and obstacles and repetitions that keep them mired in their own symptomatology. Uh, I believe one of the major goals of any type of successful psychoanalytic treatment would would be to develop or foster more of a sense of agency in the patient.
And you ain't getting disagreement from me on that. It's it's what I didn't see. And back when I was learning about psychoanalysis, the sense of agency, much more looking at your psyche and making the unconscious conscious in a way that then you could deal with your unconscious. But the agency part of it was so slow in coming out. 5 times a week. When
Yeah.
I was in psychodynamic psychotherapy twice a week, it took 6 months for the guy to say anything. Uh,
Well,
and, and that That seemed to be not the right thing.
No,
Uh,
gosh, no, that sounds
uh,
incompetent.
uh,
Uh,
he, he was a great teacher. He had a seminar. That's how I got to meet him. But back then, there was not much emphasis. Even my therapist now, who's psychodynamically oriented, psychologist, she's not there in an active way that describes agency as a vital outcome. And that's a debate we can have and happens in psychoanalysis. But let me go back to your book and to a related question. If I understand it correctly, you invoke collective moral action as a response to what's going on around here, while simultaneously acknowledging that individual contributions are negligible. That's you can correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't that leave your reader and civilization in a kind of ethical void where responsibility is everyone's and therefore no one's?
that's a good point. And it's an inherent contradiction that does need to be addressed. On one hand, I believe um, I was the context was what can I do about, let's say, the fact that the world is burning, or that our climate is in crisis. What can I do as one person? I can I can do things that make me feel better as a human being, but will my one actions change any of that? It's not likely. On the other hand, it would take individual responsibility to do something and contribute to some cause or way of ameliorating our current state of affairs. And then the more people to do that, then you have more of a collective voice or movement that might have some kind of beneficial factor on the future. So it is a contradiction, and yet at the same time, how does one resolve that?
I think you pointed to how to resolve it, John. Um, you take many individuals who have been able to find some form of agency, which is to believe that they are capable of making some kind of change. You imbue them with the notion that each of them has a unique contribution to make to the collective whole. So part of psychoanalysis is to answer the age-old question, who am I? And one of the who am I answers is, what do I do out there? It's not just my self-definition or what other people think of me, but how do I operate in the world? Who is the me that works out there in civilization within social groups? And that's a key element of this. So if you're able to help people through psychoanalysis find a sense of agency and help them recognize that their agency can be a unique contribution to helping this world get better, then we're talking about collecting people who can do that somehow, finding each other. Uh, I have ways of understanding how that can happen because you can resonate with people who are like minds and like hearts, so that you go from what appears to be a pessimistic perspective in the question that I ask you, but you then take the next step, which you also describe as collective action. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, I guess the trick is to get the collective together.
You got it, baby. You got it. The, hey, let me say that over again. You know, it's like, how do we get those guys to play on the same team? Well, when I was in sixth, eighth grade, you go knock on the guy's door and say, is Jimmy home? Is Johnny home? Oh, okay. Hey, you want to go play baseball over at over at the experimental station? So you got to knock on the door and see if anybody's home. Uh, so there's some kind of outreach that's necessary to find people to pop up to play the game. It does take that. And I am trying to do that with this podcast, is to be able to find people who, like you, are very interested in, and know that we have to do something about the future of humanity and begin collecting them. And it's kind of like a stamp collection thing. I mean, I used to collect stamps, but it isn't that. It's finding them, finding a way for them to meet each other, to encounter each other, to see if there's something that resonates among and between them that then can lead to some outcome, a collective outcome that we all need to be able to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, well put.
Thank you.
How do we have shared collective identifications around certain values that we can nurture among ourselves and a group, and then carry that on to other people and help enlighten themselves? I find that to be tricky.
Oh, it
Even
is. People, people are weird, man. There's all kinds. Okay, what? That happened? It's, 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 it happens. And one of the elements that I'm introducing in this book I'm writing, it's therapy for humanity that I'm writing about. It's putting humanity not on the couch, but somewhere in space, and being in a therapy-like place. Is how do you organize the individuals so that they can become recognized that we are part of this one thing. We are the collective human organism, and each one of us is a cell in that organism. And we need to be able to find ways to both have our individuality expressed and ways to connect with each other. And that connecting with each other is part of the problem is we do this thing called conflict. And one of the things that I'd ask you to think about here, from your psychodynamic, psychoanalytic perspective, is projection. Uh, project we project all the time, and we've got to, because that's the beginning of empathy. Because you begin to say, that person's feeling something that I recognize in myself, so I can put that on the other person, but then more comes along with that. uh, and you project more onto the other person. So the difference between projection and empathy in interpersonal relationships looks like a fundamental issue. Comment on that, please.
yeah, that's well, yeah, that's a very good point. Often, I mean, projection can take so many different forms. They're very benign forms, uh, but in the more insidious way, where there's a displacement of some kind of internal aggression or hatred onto another object. I mean, really objectifying a person or a group. Um, there's a blind spot. You forget about that this is a human being, and so the ability for an empathic understanding of the other is eclipsed for one's own need to deject something a negative in themselves. But it goes both ways. So you have all people projecting on one another, and that this now really creates roadblocks to empathy. When I think it takes more of a sense of maturity to realize that you come to identify with perspective of the other that you have in yourself that you're trying to displace or get rid of, and then you see the humanity in an individual. It's much more difficult than to hold on to hatred or aggression in that moment. You see them as you are, human beings struggling, and they want to be understood. They want to be recognized, and that's hopeful that the human connection and the need for relationality is what can bring people together. A mutual sense of empathy and mutual recognition is really the key. How do we get there? How do we foster that? Whether it be in ourselves, whether it be in the therapy, whether it be on the streets and collectives of peoples. The problem systemically, though, is that these collectives, social collectives, have different fundamental value systems that can clash with one another, and then hence, if we can't come around some kind of common thread or form some kind of unity about shared values that we mutually identify with and want to promote, we keep mired into the negative. And group psychology, group processes, organizational processes, they're hard to mediate when you're outside of the individual level.
Who's the mediator?
Well, ultimately, it should be ourselves. That we, as you're talking about earlier, a certain self-responsibility we have to our own agency and making choices that are deliberate, that are thoughtful, and that are authentic.
What's authentic?
That's another good question, because one can be an authentic asshole. So, in a positive spirit, it would be in many ways, in addition to the normative notion of finding your voice or being able to actualize your choices in life and make change and things like this, I think it has a lot to do with the coming into being of self-consciousness and becoming more aware of who you are, your place in the world, your obligations to self and others. And ultimately, I think it's an ethical relation, but it also could be an aesthetic one, a spiritual one, you name it. So authenticity is really a process of becoming. Jung would call it a process of individuation, as you know. And sometimes that is not going well. I would say it's never going to be easy. It's work, and it's a labor toward overcoming certain obstacles in oneself, in one's life, dealing with our defenses in an honest way, and then accepting truth and reality honestly. And then when you do that, you're much more likely to be, to live more of an authentic life.
It's knowing who you are intrapsychically and interpersonally, and I'll say socially. Knowing who you are. One of the a function that is essential to that, I think Anna Freud might have used the term observing ego. What's the observing ego to you, and how does that play a role in this?
Well, in many ways, it's a very important aspect of of cognitive development, that one needs to be able to step back and take a look at yourself, um, and ask, how do you think you come across to other people? And it's being aware that you are a subject among other subjects, that you're able to observe yourself, to think about how you are relating to others, and also to look internally, honestly, at your desires, your conflicts, um, your shadow side, the negativity in you, and embrace it honestly, and try to transform it in creative ways, rather than to negate them, deny them, or to evacuate them through projective methods.
You're describing what the result of activating the observing ego, which I call the observing self, to be able to look around and see what's there inside of you and interpersonally and what's around you, and to look at that whole scene in what we might call an objective way, cleared of the distortions of projection and defenses. I'm asking you about the observing ego itself. You told me about its functions, and maybe that's the only way to define it. But it's also, it seems to me, a form of consciousness that each of us has in our own minds. And so I'm asking you to describe the observing ego itself.
Well, I guess, if I had to take a stab at it, I would say it's more of a, development of self-consciousness, and not just consciousness, but the ability for self-reflexivity.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that is more of a, developmental achievement. A lot of people aren't
Yeah.
at
No.
they're not at that level.
You betcha. You betcha. As this guy from North Dakota say, you betcha. A lot of people haven't gotten it developed, and it's a necessary development in order to be able to look around inside and outside and be able to make some judgments about what's a good thing, what's not such a good thing. Now, let me pop that up to an idea of a collective human organism, and suggest that the part of the future of humanity requires something very similar: the development of a an observing self, an ego, an observing ego for humanity, to do much the same thing that happens in psychotherapy, is to look inside and look outside and see what is going on around me, humanity, in both spheres. What do you think of that?
Well, like, when you look at people's individual lives, and I would say most people, at least that I know or I observe in my little sphere of the world, they do pursue activities that are relationally driven, that they are interested in developing social circles, or meaningful groups of friends, and some of them come together around common causes. And so I think your question really is, it's about motivating people to come together around common values and causes. And how do we do that on a grand scale? That's where I don't have the solution, but nevertheless see the the value of that movement that I think that you're trying to generate here.
Yeah, it's a grand scale for sure, but we are a grand scale that's destroying our habitat. For example, I imagine humanity as a kind of Bigfoot clomping around on forests and people and civilizations, just because it's trying to feed itself while destroying what it's feeding off of. And
Mhm.
so I'm trying to say, very much like with an individual who's destroying his or her life and the people around them, but recognize there's a problem, that developing an observing ego or a self-observer becomes an essential part of what psychotherapy would be trying to help that person develop. Same for humanity.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, makes sense to me.
Good, because that's the direction I'm going. And what about the idea of human beings being part of a collective human organism to to you?
Yeah, I mean, we would have to be, wouldn't we? I mean,
Dip, 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 dip. Have you ever noticed that the obvious sometimes evades some of your patients? Ever notice that?
yeah, well,
It's it's one of our favorite things is say say something like I did with my patient the other day that her husband has been telling her time and time again. I love that when it happens. The spouse is saying it and then I say it. Oh, then it must be true, but they don't believe the spouse.
so,
It's one of those funny things, but it's a pattern. It's one of those things that happen. From an objective perspective, it's still the same idea, but she hears it differently when it comes from me. And it reinforces what she's been hearing from her husband. Kevin's been telling me that for years. Okay, so we have some idea that we're part of a collective human organism, but we don't know it.
yeah. Well, I guess people do live in, a sense of alienation from this abstract notion of collective humanity. They they don't see any connection. They don't see that they participate in a human process that we all do. Um, and again, these are like people's defenses. They kick in and say, "I can't do anything about these big problems. I'm gonna have to, let others handle it. It's too much for me to
Yeah,
do."
yeah, that's what they do, but they haven't the concept of the collective human organism, and it's looks like it's abstract as you called it, but it is not, because as I mentioned, it's like Bigfoot clomping on our environment and destroying our habitat. It's real, and it's just a new concept for many people to think of themselves as functioning like a cell, both individually and collectively, as part of this collective human organism that we call humanity. It's just it's just another new idea, It's like so so Anna Freud came up with defenses. I mean, it was been around for a while, but she's able to label it. So it's not like the idea isn't there, because people recognize the global warming. I got a kick out of that change. Now it's climate change. Those PR guys really did well in making everybody say climate change. It's heating up the planet. That's what we're doing. But no. So the words are really important, and the labels are really important. And here, this label of collective human organism with a collective self-observer is a basic idea of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy applied large. And that's what you were trying to be able to do, in my view, is be able to conceptualize this whole thing that is really going badly And I'm trying to suggest to you that there are some ways to get out of this, to reverse the trajectory as we do with suicidal patients who think when they're suicidal, they'll never get out of it. I mean, that's like anxious people, depressed people. It's only the way it is. And then they get out of it and say, well, I didn't think I'd ever get out of it. And then they go back in again and they still think they're never going to get out of it again. Humanity's like that right now. We can never do it. But if there's an idea, if there's an optimism with an idea, collective human organism, collective self-observer, then the psychodynamic ideas begin to apply to humanity as a whole, where its collective traumas need to be addressed, where its projections among and between each other need to be addressed, where our relationship to the environment needs to be recognized. We are part of it and it is part of us.
Yeah, and you made me think about what would be an event that would change people, wake them up, so to speak. Um, I think to use Freud's notion of the reality principle. And so when you're talking about Bigfoot out there, consuming and destroying the environment, I mean, at some point, the environment's going to punish you. It's going to cause people to wake up. They're going to say, we have to change our way of being, or we'll be destroying ourselves.
Yes.
And that hasn't happened yet. In fact, you have politicians who want to deny, that there's anything wrong with the burning of fossil fuels and all these other things. But at some point, um, people are going to say this is bullshit. We do have to change. We have to vote for different people in office to change these policies, and that we have to do some self-sacrifice. We have to give up some things that we were used to in our own comfortable life. So whether that be financial or whether that be, just regulatory changes in the way we consume things. So that's the collective that I'm hoping will, start to organize.
There is loss in change.
Yeah.
It's part of the reason change is so difficult. And
Sure.
you're describing the losses that are likely to happen. It's just that being able to fly from cold Canada to Italy is not something everybody can do. And that may be, you may have to go to Nova Scotia or something uh, to be able to, that won't do it either. But it's, John took a vacation. He's a Canadian and he went to Europe, warm Europe, to get away from the Canadian winters, which can be a little brisk, which is why a lot of them go down to Florida. But that's another story. We may have to give up some of the pleasures we have, particularly those of us who are able to live in a first world level, and that is sacrifice, and change requires loss. And how much are we willing to give up? And the people who say we can keep burning fuels, fossil fools, is there. And they're making money off of it, and people are, and they want to keep it going the same. So it takes a smaller group of people to start it. People who are illustrating how humanity could begin to come together, and it's never going to be all of humanity. It's never going to be everyone. But a certain number tends to be an old idea that a few can make a larger change, and we need a larger change. And what we're talking about is an optimism that I take from psychoanalytic thinking with the observing ego, the self-observer, collect the self-observer people and help the cells start organizing to know who they are and how they relate to each other. And that's only going to be a part of humanity. The rest of them, part of the body, is going to be doing various different things. So I'm
Mhm.
still, as we get near the end of this, Jon, I'm trying to get to some optimism in your cold Canadian way. Um, and Freud was, as we talked about, thought the death thanatos, the death drive, was a major force. Eros was the other one, and there was always a conflict between the two of them. And Freud took a long time to. Hey, there's thanatos too out there. He was big on the Freud part, the joy part, the Eros part. And there's a death wish in a lot of people here. And we could say humanity has a death wish too. We also could say humanity's got a lot of Eros running around too. And it's a conflict, and that's conflict is the meat of psychodynamic thinking. As you got to resolve those, but of any therapy and of any life. So tell us about what could be Jon Mills's optimism about the future of humanity.
Well, just to segue off your discussion of the duality of desire, um, the optimistic part of me is very Hegelian, and that is that conflicts or oppositions are mutually implicative, and that means you can't have one without the other. Uh, in isolation, you can focus on one, but it ultimately exists in relation to opposition. So the optimistic side of me is that there are movements of elevation that come with dialectical interchanges. And more simplistically, um, Jung referred to it as a transcendent function. So we can move to a higher level of development as the human race. And that would be either neutralizing or maintaining, the tension of opposites. But it would be ideal if it could be moved to a higher plane, to a greater state of self-consciousness. And that would be ultimately, I think, an ethical one, that we are brought together under the common thread, optimistic thread of what is going to be, better for humanity. And so that's I think that's a trajectory too. It's a slow process of development of the human race. It's just that there are always these regressive forces that are at play: greed, aggression, evil, things like this that can draw people back. But just like you mentioned, Eros, there is also that complementary side, that side that wants to transcend or surpass the pure negativity.
Well, I'm very glad you bring up Hegel and thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that something can come out of conflict. One thing, another thing, bop, 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 poop, he gets something else. And that something else can apply very much to conflict between people and nations and groups. That to recognize that in conflict there is generativity. In conflict, something can come out of it if both parts of the conflict recognize that by being in this, there's emotion, there's intensity, and that's the birthplace of something new. That's part of what I am trying to describe in my book, the value of conflict, particularly interpersonal conflict. Nah, walk away. Okay. That's a basic, I think, fact of this reality that we don't want to pay attention to because we get caught up in I'm right and you're wrong. And that has to be a fundamental part of the development of the new human, as I'm trying to describe. So I'm glad to be able to end our conversation with that idea because it's fundamental to the future of humanity to use conflict as a way of evolving.
Yes. Well, that's great. I look forward to see your book when it comes out.
Uh, I look forward to see it when it comes out too. To tell you, you know how that is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, John, for being with me today. And here's this book, The End of the World. Sounds like Revelation to me. Uh, that title, Civilization and Its Discontents. No, no, Civilization and Its Fate. Um, Somehow there's Freud behind that subtitle.
Yeah.
Uh, and I don't think that's an accident. So
No, it's not. Well, I appreciate everything, Bernie, you've done. And thanks for having me on your show. It was a pleasure.
you're very welcome. You're very welcome, John. I'm glad to have you.